Hey everyone, my name is Suken. The topic that we're going to be talking about today is the next Indonesia, which is I think a funny topic to talk about sitting in Indonesia as we go about it. Maybe context for this question is, I think generally kind of in the startup ecosystem and definitely kind of amongst investors, Indonesia is kind of a country that's talked a lot about, both because of kind of the opportunity and the population and the economic growth. And so Indonesia is kind of like a favorite child within Southeast Asia to kind of invest in the startup economy and stuff. Something that we kind of talk about at Iterative quite often is Indonesia is often the only country that you can start a company and stay in that country and be $1 billion company. I don't think that can happen in any other countries yet. And so that's kind of context for this conversation. So where we're going to kind of go with this is find out where the quote unquote next Indonesia is and what other markets are interesting to our esteemed panel here and where they're interested, how the market has changed. Maybe as a good place to start, we'll kind of take opening statements in the sense of like what other countries are you guys kind of interested in, and maybe we'll pick one country, talk about why you're kind of interested in that. And maybe I'll start with you, Eddie, since your VC fund focuses specifically on Vietnam, so I'm guessing you have a strong position here. So maybe I'll start with you.
That's right. Thanks for that, and I'll introduce. Hi, I'm Eddie Tai. I'm a general partner of Ascend Vietnam Ventures. We're a seed stage Vietnam-focused fund. Our team has been operating in Vietnam since 2015, and to date we've invested in about 90 companies, not just in Vietnam, also in other parts of Southeast Asia as well as North America. We chose Vietnam because we believe Vietnam is the next Indonesia, if that can be a thing, although I think it's a false question. Lots of respect to Indonesia, of course, and it's a giant market. I mean, 6 times larger than Vietnam as an economy, so no illusion that Indonesia is going to be the main event for a while longer. But if we're talking about an encore 10 years from now, then Vietnam's certainly there. It's been growing 7% per year for the last 30 years. 100 million young, increasingly affluent people who not only understand their problems locally, but have gotten a lot of exposure abroad, which hints to the next part of my question. Hints to the angle I will take later in the panel, but I'll pass the mic over to Pinn next.
Hi guys, I'm Pinn and I'm a partner at Lightspeed. We're a global venture firm and I'm based in Singapore, but primarily also just invest multi-stage in the region. Indonesia obviously being one important darling and will continue to be, I'd say, right? But just to be more specific to answering your question, I think the country that I pick would be Singapore. I think because of 2 things. One, we have obviously also seen that there can be one way is to build a very large vertical company in Indonesia, right? The other way is to be stay in one vertical but be regional, right? And there's space for both, and Singapore will continue to be that hub, I would say, to attracting talent, to be the base that executives can fly from to and fro just because of the geographical centricity and convenience and efficiency of the country, and also as a government desire to attract more of such talent. So I think that's one, and the other thing is that we've been also tracking or really starting to observe is Singapore's position in this new political environment that we're in, right? The global political tension, across the world, really. We don't have to, go too much into detail with that. But I think Singapore is really benefiting from that, right? You can see that already in kind of the, I think blockchain was a start, but even now Gen AI, when people talk about foundational model, there's a political angle to it, right? And so many people, when people talk about downstream capital investment, like LPs are, they are very strict and actually very growing concerns actually on where GPs choose to allocate money, and that I think has a market moving impact on capital allocation. But all of that actually today, Singapore is a very big favorite and kind of a bit of a beneficiary, if you would, right, for this trend. Yeah. So.
Hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Gavin. I'm a general partner at Altara Ventures. I'm based in Singapore, but our fund is a Series A lead fund with offices here in Jakarta as well as Ho Chi Minh City. I think when we look at market opportunity across countries in the region, the first thing we should recognize is 36 of the 48 Southeast Asia unicorns are cross-border by nature. So when we think about the region, Indonesia, Vietnam, Singapore, they are intertwined economies in many ways. If we go back to, say, the 1950s and 60s, the UN Development Program issued a range of reports that made predictions on what were the first breakout economies in Southeast Asia. And you guys may know this or not, but I was surprised that the two sort of most promising bright lights at that point in time were the Philippines and Myanmar, at the time Burma. So a lot has changed. I mean, these are still interesting economies to invest in and are absolutely growing. But Indonesia has really become such a shining light in the region because of the combination of good policies, as Pinn mentioned, great market opportunity, a deep capital market phase where investment is entered, but of course, core tech and great entrepreneurial talent. So I expect more of that to happen across the region. In answering the question where we're focused, I think the biggest markets outside of Indonesia would be Philippines and Vietnam from a population standpoint, 100 million population each. When we look at GDP per capita, we're actually quite interested at the Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand land corridor, if you will. So these would be middle income, if not relatively higher income economies in the region. GDP per capita roughly 2 times what we see in Indonesia and Vietnam, but of course, these are gross generalizations. And then I think another way of answering the question, perhaps in a trite way, is that the next Indonesia will be Indonesia, right? If we think about how markets need to reinvigorate and rejuvenate, there's a long cycle to innovation. Foreign direct investment in this region, Southeast Asia, totals 200 billion a year. In a good year, VC investment is 10% of that. So a lot of that capital from sources globally go into areas like primary industries, manufacturing, agriculture, automotive, energy. And so I think these are the areas where we're just scratching the tip of the iceberg in Indonesia and in the region for new opportunities to invest.
Thank you. I think what's interesting about kind of the answers and stuff too is that there's a lot of different ways that you can kind of like answer this question or look at this question. One, you can look at population. One, you can look at GDP. I think, Pinn, you had an interesting answer. Singapore operates in kind of like a different kind of vacuum because of its kind of like central kind of like place where a lot of kind of money is and that kind of stuff. And so there's kind of like different ways that you can kind of look at kind of market opportunities against this. Maybe one thing, and we were talking about in the back room a little bit, another kind of area to look at this too is where are people kind of under-investing? And so there's kind of like, okay, GDP, there's okay, market opportunity and that kind of stuff. And the best opportunity for a lot of investors is what market is really good and people are not investing in, right? And so does that change, if you put that lens through it, does that change your guys' answer at all? Is it kind of like still kind of the same, you think?
Reinforces the answer, supporting Vietnam. I mean, we were just chatting. We did one investment in Indonesia with our last fund. It hasn't gone very well, and perhaps that should be predicted because there is so much capital here in Indonesia that by the time an opportunity comes to a Vietnamese VC, it's like, why? Why has nobody else taken this one up yet? So, yeah, Vietnam is still very underpenetrated by comparison, which means entry valuations are more reasonable. The capital journey from seed all the way on to growth is more rationalized, generally speaking. And that makes the return opportunities from a venture perspective stronger, and from potentially a founder's perspective, less dilutive as well in the long run. So yeah, I think it supports Vietnam if you consider the competitive dynamics on the investing side as well.
I think that would change a little in the, I guess, the definition of the word, like where is under, invested. I'd say I will probably take the, I think 2 lenses. One is, the areas. I do think we need more growth capital today. It's there many growth investors pull out of the region as a result of the financial I wouldn't say collapse, but downturn almost, right? So I think we are a little bit. I feel like we don't have a lot of investment in as a fund, from funding perspective in that, and I think that's I think that it is long term. I have to believe that it's long-term good allocation, good asset class, right? Growth, Southeast Asia. So that's one lens. And the other lens is probably a bit more which function, right? Or which industry or sector. I don't participate in as many. I think Gavin probably a lot more. But I do think, foundational, industries that do need digitization, like healthcare. I'll continue to think, banking infrastructure, fintech, very underpenetrated. We'll definitely see, big outcomes there because these generally are the next wave after, the consumer wave, right? Or the SME wave, right? So I think that's where I would say, that will be the different lens I'll take.
Yeah.
Gavin?
So places that are, yeah, okay, thanks. I think regionally, we source about 35% of our deal flow from Indonesia, maybe 25% from Vietnam, reflective of where our offices are. And then after that, it's Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, right, and within the ASEAN 6. If I think about our portfolio construction, we have 3 companies here, 2 in Vietnam, soon more, and then 1 or 2 in the other ASEAN markets. So from a yield perspective, what we see versus at least our fund, what we close, actually yield is higher in the other perhaps smaller economies in the region. I think one market that we're trying to spend more time to parse out is the Philippines. I think it's a market that is quite tightly family controlled, and CVCs or corporate venture funds linked to family interests. So perhaps less open than Indonesia, or Vietnam, or Singapore, but I think one that also has a lot of potential for growth. And then I agree with Pinn on sector coverage. I think in the first wave of this entire region, consumer and consumer adjacent led the first set of exits, IPO activity, unicorns, and platforms. So that's marketplace, e-commerce, fintech, and logistics largely, right, to integrate everything that's being traded online with on and offline services and fulfillment. I think the next phase will be in B2B or areas like healthcare and education, where there has been perhaps less new technology-enabled supply to meet a demand-supply gap. So these are some of the areas that we're looking at. And I think actually that's fairly well penetrated in Indonesia, or well supplied, but in the rest of the region, it's much more nascent.
I think you both hit a lot of good points there. Particularly our next market we look at in Southeast Asia is Philippines for similar reasons that you said. And going to the last thing you just mentioned around what founders have been focused on in the region over the last decade. Of course, a lot of founders focus on the more obvious low-hanging fruit opportunities in their home markets. And so then in that kind of environmental effort, entrepreneurial effort, then Indonesia would see a lot of larger companies rise serving their local market. I think ultimately the biggest value that we can create as entrepreneurs and VCs out of Southeast Asia isn't just serving our home markets or even just serving our region, but this notion that anyone anywhere can build for markets well beyond their home, worldwide. And this is actually the core thesis that we have at AVV, is that we're not actually investing necessarily in startups that are just serving the Vietnam market. Yeah, it starts there, but kind of like, I guess, certain other small countries like Israel and Singapore, you have to think beyond borders to really hit your $10 billion plus outcomes. And between that and the diaspora community that exists, the globally distributed other resources that exist that are connected to Vietnam, I think it makes it a very interesting place. There's a fact, Vietnam sends more students to study abroad for university than the next 3 countries in Southeast Asia combined. Indonesia, Singapore, and the Philippines. Combined. There are currently 5 million Vietnamese living overseas. A lot of them in different countries around the world, but including Silicon Valley, including other tech hubs around the world. And they are increasingly connecting back to the mother country to either build something out of Vietnam or to support those who are building out of Vietnam. And so we're already seeing the effects of that. If we think, I'm just asking backstage around, let's say, EdTech, which is, I think, an exciting category many of us are looking at over the next few years. Which countries have produced, in Southeast Asia, have produced EdTech companies that have served 50 countries, 100 countries worldwide? I think only Vietnam. Somebody call me out if I'm wrong. Elsa has developed an English learning app that serves users in 100 countries around the world. Virtual Internships has built a platform to help students around the world get professional experiences virtually. They serve students in 80 countries around the world. Both of those founded in Vietnam. And we can go to another sector as well, Web3. I mean, that is really borderless, right? One of the biggest sensations out of Web3 out of Southeast Asia was actually Infinity. That hit its peak when they had fewer than 100 people, 98% of them based in Ho Chi Minh City. So, and I don't think it's just Vietnam that can do this. I think that Vietnam has advantages that allows it to do this, but I think many countries in Southeast Asia can do this. And in fact, I think this is one of the things that Indonesia, it's kind of the double-edged sword of Indonesia's a large market. Because it's so big here, it's easy to start focusing here and want to just focus here. But then it's almost risking missing the forest for the trees.
And maybe to kind of like talk a little bit about kind of, I think you were starting to talk about this. The market has obviously kind of changed quite a lot in the last couple of years, right? So I think we were definitely kind of like quite at a high. The market has come down quite a lot. I think we're trying to like look for the bottom, or we're kind of searching around there or something like that. Has that changed how you guys kind of think about kind of geography of kind of like investing, or is it kind of more or less the same kind of coming out of it at the high and as it is kind of like now? How do you guys kind of like think about that?
Sorry, can I clarify the question? Is the question, global venture market?
Yeah, I think maybe just for you guys, I think like, let's say you were investing, I don't know, 30% of your money in Indonesia before, 10% in Vietnam, 20% in kind of Singapore before. The market kind of come down. Has any of those kind of ratios kind of like changed for you guys? Have you guys kind of changed how you think about it?
For me, no. I guess we have been always been quite regional, and for us, I mean, we don't have a massive fund, and so we don't really need to kind of balance the portfolio. We can be very focused on, at least that's our investment philosophy, right? We can just focus on the team, the founders, and every year, each partner makes 2 to 3 investments, max 4. Like maybe that's a little bit of a privileged position also, but we can really just look at whatever and really make decision based on the team and the opportunity that the team propose, right? So I think, for us, at least at Lightspeed, we don't have any allocation to even talk about. Yeah, we are very founder biased. If in one crop one year it happens to be 4 Indonesian founder, then that year is 100% Indonesian, right? So that's how at least we think about it. So change for me.
What about you guys? Gavin, we will start with you.
100%. Actually, I'm very bullish about where we sit right now in Southeast Asia. It may not seem so, given the stats suggest that venture funding activity contracted by about 50% in the last 12 months. But I think we are 9 to 12 months behind the US, and the US has started to recover. So if you look at core inflation, it's down to 3% over the summer versus double digits in the US. And so headline interest rates are supposed to cap out, right, at around 5.75%. So we are probably at the low point on capital markets activity. And if we look at the S&P, it's up 16% this year. The NASDAQ is up about 34%. So overall, the US corrected very hard in 2022, bounced back about halfway this year. Southeast Asia started correcting a bit later, and I think we're still in a softer window. But this is the best time to lean in across the region, for sure. If we look at some of the core indicators, macroeconomic numbers would suggest core inflation in the big economies like Indonesia and Vietnam is sub 5%. And growth across the region is expected to be close to 5%, again, GDP growth year on year in 2023. So if you compare that to the developed world or even China bouncing back from COVID low, it's a very good time. So when I think about where we would lean in, geographically, that's my answer. Sector-wise, I think we're actually very well placed because of some of the global macroeconomic and geopolitical considerations. There is a hard tech competition going on between superpowers right now. There is a battle for silicon superiority. TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor, is opening up factories in Southeast Asia. Tesla is opening up robotics manufacturing. So in some of these areas beyond e-commerce and consumer tech, there will be capital flowing in from corporate as well as private sources because Southeast Asia is seen as a relatively neutral ground as the US and China decouple. And I think the countervailing arguments would be, of course, that China growth this year is going to be a bit softer due to the open question mark around the property bubble that they're working through. And of course, very sad events like Ukraine and Israel continue to plague and divide Western attention on a number of fronts. So I think those are open question marks, but generally we sit at a cyclically very interesting time. So our activity actually has picked up quite a bit in the last 12 months.
Yeah, it's a tough time for growth stage startups for sure, and that will persist for a while longer. Seed stage builders are going to build, and they are fortunate to not have the cost structures that their later stage counterparts have. So we typically like to do about $1 million per company into maybe 2 to 3 companies per quarter. We're not fixed to that. Second half of last year, we did 0 for the whole second half of last year. Through September of this year, we've done a deal a month. That's the higher and highest end of our target range. So we do consider the macros to a degree, but really aligned with Pinn's approach here of when the good founder comes, you invest in them. Don't worry about the world. They'll figure their way through it.
And you led to this at the very beginning, but we're sitting in Indonesia. I think there's a lot of kind of Indonesians in the crowd and stuff. Maybe coming back to Indonesian stuff. You were saying that you're joking that, look, the next Indonesia I think is kind of Indonesia, right? Do you guys kind of agree with that statement? You guys think, hey, maybe if we're thinking about this in cycles, we kind of had this high, we've come down. There's going to be another high. I think we all believe we're quite bullish on it. Otherwise, we all wouldn't be doing what we're doing. Do you think kind of Indonesia will kind of come out of the next cycle too as kind of the next Indonesia?
Yeah, I think so. It has to, because at the end of the day, it's a big fraction of Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is not interesting without Indonesia, right? So I think that's the one way to frame this, right? There has to be, or at least we would love to believe there is, and many folks in this room should also believe that, and I have high conviction. And I didn't look for us. If you think about, and maybe the reason why is to understand that innovation is in cycles, right? But then it always upward and to the right, right? You have an emerging middle class, you have a large, young, digitally savvy, group of population. You have under penetration of, digital under digitization in so many sectors, right? Today, still banking, insurance, all these are very, clear signs that, you cannot imagine it going the other way around, right? And you can't imagine it being at this level too, 15 years from now, right? So I think in that sense, then, if you believe in these kind of broad, statements, right? I think that's the reason why, at least I speak for all of us here, I think venture capital as an asset class is very long-term, right? I'm investing not for what's going to happen in the next 2 to 3 years. We're here for 10, maybe more, right? And in that time frame, if there's a blip, that's fine, right? And that's why we back, founders. And the other thing that's also important to note is actually, in this kind of environment, I really fully agree with what Gavin said. I think competitive level, we see a lot of data across, China, India, US. I think this is a really great time for Indonesia because there's a lot of the competition is rational, right? It's we're not in an environment where there's a lot of irrational competition because there's frankly too much money at some point in time in the market, right? So I think there will be a V 2.0 of Indonesia, and maybe V 3.0, right? Yeah.
So I guess Southeast Asia kind of needs Indonesia to continue to grow for the kind of ecosystem to do well. And you're obviously kind of more focused on kind of Vietnam and that kind of stuff. Do you agree with it?
I think the region is strongest if each country does well, and Indonesia's been a powerhouse. I don't think the region falls apart if Indonesia sputters, but it's obviously been an important part of driving things forward after Singapore and Malaysia did their initial push with some of the unicorns that came out 10, 15 years ago. Echo what the other panelists have said. Kind of the way I've thought about it is a generation from now, 2050, where are the economies likely to be? What percentage of those economies ought to be digitalized? Compare that delta to where we are now, and that is massive. Massive opportunity over the next few decades. Now, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. There's going to be a lot of hard work along the way, but by and large, if you believe in the positive progression of mankind, then there's a lot going ahead. If you don't, that's another story. We maybe shouldn't be talking about this stuff right now. But as part of, besides just going country by country, I think, and then, I mentioned this notion of going global. I do think it's not just Vietnam that can do that. I mean, we've seen certain companies in other countries that have done the same. I hope more of that happens. And I think one engine for that to happen more than it currently is for, this sounds cheesy because we know Southeast Asia is not one market, but like for the strengths, the strong resources, the assets in each country to start to actually talk with each other and leverage each other more. The tech talent in, I joke, I'd love to have a CTO from Vietnam, a CFO from Singapore, a CCO from Indonesia, and like a head of product design from Thailand, and it'd be like an awesome team. And we don't see a lot of that yet because there are natural challenges in remote work, but like just to show that the strengths in certain countries are weaknesses in others and vice versa. If we can somehow make that come together, then we're going to see even larger opportunities than we're seeing right now.
It's like Southeast Asia Avengers or something like that. You're like trying to get the whole team together. Gavin, maybe you brought it up kind of like early on. Obviously, you kind of like feel that way. Do you want to kind of elaborate more on kind of the point?
Yeah, sure. So I think that what we really need in this region and in Indonesia is exits. And it's easier said than done, but I think that is what really closes the circle. It returns wealth to the entrepreneurs that have built companies, and it also instills more confidence in the LP community to put more capital into funds, and it's a virtuous cycle. Unfortunately, right now, globally, capital markets are fairly tepid, slow. But I think what's interesting here in Indonesia is that the IDX is quite progressive in encouraging both on the acceleration board and the development board versus the main board, smaller companies and tech-based companies, as well as other SMEs, to list early and tap into the retail capital markets. That's not something we see that much in the rest of the region. I think that will help. I think that as we think about the region 2.0 or Indonesia in its next phase, what it boils down to is having a stable regulatory and business environment. And there's an election next year, so expectation is that things will continue. But of course, it is a question. And then a capital market sort of depth where you have kind of access to exit routes, either through domestic IPO, regional IPO, US dual listing, or secondary and M&A sales, right? And if that's possible, as the West picks up, as some of those dynamics of, call it, superpower rivalry lead to private capital picking up assets in this region, I think the first place they'll look at would be the biggest economies like Indonesia, and I think that will help to jumpstart what we're all looking for here. So that's how I would kind of paint the picture of what needs to happen next, and we're bullish about it.
Maybe let's talk about exits a little bit. And we were joking about this with kind of like there's news on GoTo and some of these kind of stuff. Indonesia had some liquidity events, right? There's a number of companies that went public in Indonesia. And so we did see some of that. And so I think that's been a critique of Southeast Asia, there's not enough exits. We did see some, at least in kind of like Indonesia. We can debate about kind of how well they kind of like went, but like to your point about, hey, this region kind of needs more exits. How do you guys view kind of like some of the actual exits that we did get and kind of like, maybe we wish a lot of them kind of like did much better, but like how do you kind of factor that into kind of how you guys think about the ecosystem?
Look, I think let's get the elephant in the room out of the way, which is it's not performing as well as we all wish it did, right? And so that's the truth, right? So I think with that in mind, I just go back to fundamentally, first, it was never like, it's important to remind ourselves 3 years ago, we're like, is it even possible to exit, right? And now we're sitting here and like, hey, the performance is not good enough. I think that's an unfair, kind of, we're very quick to shift the goal here, right? So I think we should all remind ourselves that at least the bar for a long, long time, actually, for everybody, for venture investors, for entrepreneurs, for employees, right? Like it was always, is there a liquidity event that could substantially change lives, right? So and inspire more to do the same, right? So I think that's I'd say we scored at least in our generation, like in the last 5 years, like I think it's a decent answer, like it's a decent judgment, right? That's like we did it, right? We did it. So I feel like we shouldn't forget to also celebrate that fact, right? So then, I think then let's now talk about what does this mean, right? At least for me, it just means that the venture ecosystem just needs to mature, right? Like the performance or lack thereof today is primarily the result of, and again, I will call everyone out, right? Like which is entrepreneurs being only growth, at all costs, venture investors also participating in that, and signaling that to some extent with how we allocate our capital, in different times, right? So I think it's just, for me, it is a lesson, like a very big lesson for the ecosystem to be rational in valuation ask, competition, spend, and really like the idea that unit economics and a business requires, at the very minimum, free cash flow. And if you're in a tech, if you say you're a tech company, then your free cash flow should be a lot and very high, right? So like, how do you do that? Like just, it's just for me, it's a reminder, right? That, hey, let's learn from the past and let's make it better, right? And again, I also think it'll be in Indonesia 2.0 or Southeast Asia 2.0, maybe you will still see similar, right? But hopefully over time, that's how we as an ecosystem mature. So that's kind of my take.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's like we complained that this thing didn't happen, and then when it happened, we were like, hey, it didn't go as much as we wanted, right? It's like we graduated into the next complaint. Eddie, do you kind of have a similar kind of view?
Yeah, I'll keep it short because I think they want us to wrap up and have questions soon. But we all, startup founders, tech VCs, tech media like Tech in Asia, we're like tiger parents. It's like never good enough, right? And that's great though, because it will drive us to keep doing better. So like, I'll just wrap that up, that like, 10 years from now is gonna be, we're gonna look at today like we look at 10 years before. And we're gonna say again, oh, we got these IPOs, 10 billion, but that's not good enough. We're gonna keep pushing more, and I hope that happens. Last point is, it's one reason why I focus on these multi-market opportunities. You list on public markets, and it's just, the story is harder for folks, for global investors, when it's just one country. A lot of them don't even know Indonesia has almost 400 million people, or Vietnam has 100 million people. So if they don't even know that, how are they going to get conviction behind the stuff, the businesses, the real businesses that people are building here? Whereas as soon as you go to multiple markets, some of that Western bias fades away. They start to look at the numbers. Oh, wow, you're doing that much in revenue? Oh, wow, that much growth? And then, yes, unit economics and bottom line profitability as well. But yeah, the single country story just never flies as well with these IPOs as the multi-markets.
All right, I think our time is up. I've got multiple screens here telling me that our time is up. So thank you, everybody, for kind of listening. Yeah, thank you.